Hi ladies and gentlemen, so today I'm going to be looking at Unit 3 and we're going to be looking at the nervous system. So first up, the nervous system functioning. So the nervous system is the communication system within your body. It connects the body's internal organs and cells with the external world. It receives information, processes information, coordinates response to that information. So it's that dot point there that you really need to be focusing on for the VCAR exams. It is made up of several different branches or subsystems, including the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So this is pretty much the table that VCAR wants you to learn. You need to know what each section does. There are better diagrams out there. I recommend you at least download one of them and keep them in your notes. So the central nervous system sends and receives information to and from the CNS. So it's that bit there. Usually the questions that get asked on exams are about what they actually do. So you need to know that it sends and receives messages to and from. Alright, so it gets broken up into the brain, which processes sensory information, and the spinal cord, which connects the brain to the PNS. We might just highlight that one. It receives sensory info from the PNS and sends to the brain, and receives motor information from the brain and sends it to various parts of the body. So make sure you are aware of what the CNS does. Now the peripheral nervous system is everything else. So the peripheral nervous system is made up of the entire network of nerves outside the CNS. It carries sensory information to the CNS and carries motor information from the CNS. The autonomic nervous system connects the CNS to internal organs and glands. It's self-regulating and automatic, and make sure that when you're writing autonomic, you're not writing automatic. VCAR will not award you the points. So it is automatic, so it's not under voluntary control, and it regulates the muscles controlling organs. The somatic nervous system, and I like to highlight the S because it deals with the initiating skeletal movements. It carries sensory information to the CNS and carries motor information from the CNS. And if it's sensory, it's afferent, and if it's motor, it's efferent. So the autonomic nervous system gets broken down further into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system increases activities in the body's muscles, organs, and glands, so it stimulates. It prepares the body for action. It triggers the flight, fight, freeze response and is usually triggered by a stressor or a fear stimulus. It releases hormones such as adrenaline from the adrenal glands. Heart rate and breathing rate increases. Parasympathetic nervous system decreases activity, so it brings the body back into peace or homeostasis. It calms the body down after action. It dominates the sympathetic nervous system most of the time. So right now you should be in the sympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic nervous system. It takes longer to return the body to its normal state as it has to remove hormones from the bloodstream. Alright, so the distinction between conscious and unconscious responses by the nervous system to sensory stimuli, including the role of the spinal reflex. So a conscious response is something that involves awareness and is voluntary. It's usually going to occur after you have paid attention to the stimulus. So if it's cold outside, you might put a jumper on. If it's hot outside, you might take your jumper off. You might put sunglasses on. An unconscious response is a reaction that doesn't involve awareness. It's involuntary and automatic. So in other words, if you happen to go outside and it's quite bright outside, your eyes automatically, shut and they blink close. These are controlled by the autonomic nervous system, and it could be blinking, heart beating, breathing, whatever. These are reflexive responses, so you can't actually make a conscious choice or response. A spinal reflex is an unconscious and involuntary response, and they're the words you have to use. So this one here and this one here you must use in your definitions. So it occurs automatically to certain stimulus without any involvement of the brain. For example, if you touch something hot, your hand will pull away immediately. Alrighty, so you need to be able to describe this. So I would recommend maybe even copying and pasting or screenshotting this particular slide because it's actually a pretty good one. So pain receptors in the skin feel the hot object. The afferent neurons send the message to the spinal cord and interneuron. So we've got the hot object there, it's moving down, and so assume that it is in that green little response there. It's going all the way down to the spinal cord, right? So these are the afferent or sensory neurons. The interneuron, which is this one, and I'm going to put it in red. This is the interneuron right here, right? Sends messages to the motor neuron. And then the motor neuron, we're going to do in blue, right? Sends a message back as quickly as possible to the arm muscles, making the muscles contract so they move away from the object. At the same time, a message is being sent to the brain to inform the brain of what's happened. But it needs to do this quickly and without the involvement of the brain to protect you from any kind of danger. A mnemonic to remember the order of the spinal reflex arc, so receptor, afferent or sensory nerve, center, brain or spinal cord, efferent or motor nerve, or effector. I personally like the diagram, but whatever floats your boat. Alright, you need to know how the message or information travels through a neuron as well. And we did this in year 11, right? But essentially a neuron's individual nerve cell is specialized to receive, process, and transmit information to other cells in the body. Make sure you can describe it and you know which each feature of the neuron is. And you need to know the parts of the neuron. So the dendrites are extensions of a neuron that detect and receive information from other neurons. The axon is a single extension that transmits information to other neurons or cells. So it transmits information. The soma is the cell body, which receives the neural information from the dendrites and sends it to the axon. The myelin is a white fatty substance that surrounds and insulates the axon and allows for the rapid movement of the message along the neurons. Messages travel much faster through neurons wrapped in myelin than neurons that are not, because it gets disrupted. Small gaps between the myelin sheath are called the nodes of Ranvier. Axon terminals, so at the very end of the axon, there are small branches called axon collaterals. At the end of the collaterals are axon terminals. Each axon terminal has a small knob-like swelling at its tip called a terminal button. The terminal button is a small structure that secretes neurotransmitter. So terminal buttons secrete, which carry its chemical message to other neurons or cells. The synaptic gap is a tiny gap, so it's this section here, between the dendrites of one neuron and the terminal buttons of another neuron. It is part of the synapse where the communication between two neurons occur. So the role of the neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemical substances produced by a neuron that carry messages to other neurons or cells. Sorry, I'm very bad at highlighting. When carrying a message to another neuron, neurotransmitter works by attaching themselves to receptor sites of postsynaptic neurons. The neurons then that release the neurotransmitter is called the presynaptic neuron. So whatever releases it, terrible highlighting, is called the presynaptic neuron. Any neurotransmitters that don't bind to the receptors of the postsynaptic neuron, and postsynaptic neuron is the next neuron, are absorbed back into the terminal buttons of the presynaptic neuron. This is called reuptake. Neurotransmitters have either an excitatory effect, so they stimulate postsynaptic neurons to fire, or an inhibitory effect, preventing postsynaptic neurons from firing. So glutamate is the main excitatory neurotransmitter. and enhances information transmission by making postsynaptic neurons more likely to fire. It is associated with increases in learning and memory. Gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA, is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in the CNS. It works throughout the brain to make postsynaptic neurons less likely to fire. All right. Most people remember GABA and glutamate in terms of the the stoplight. So GABA slows it down and glutamate makes it go. Essentially, when you're thinking about the role of neurotransmitters, you also got to think of it in terms of the lock and key process. So chemical neuron transmission is often referred to as a lock and key process because the neurotransmitter's shape must precisely match the shape of the receptor site. So it has to fit like a lock into a key. Reverse that, key into a lock. So the lock and key process is a model of synaptic transmission posits that neurotransmitters only affect postsynaptic receptor sites that they have the correct shape for that particular molecule, in the same way that a key has to have the same shape to fit the lock. GABA makes it less likely that the molecules will be received by the postsynaptic receptor sites. Glutamate makes it more likely that the molecules will be received by the postsynaptic receptor sites. So pretty much remember those two elements there. So we'll be looking at how GABA actually influences Parkinson's disease. And what you need to remember is that if we have too much or too little of a particular neurotransmitter, it can actually affect us. And that's what happens with Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's disease is actually a neurodegenerative disease, and that should be the first thing that you write when you are answering the question in the SAC or exam. It is caused by a loss of neurons in the substantia nigra, which has a role in the control of voluntary muscle movements. And those voluntary muscle movements are there so you can have smooth and coordinated movements. So think about it this way. People with Parkinson's disease tend to have tremors and tend to have difficulty walking and doing smooth actions because the neurotransmitters in the substantia nigra have been affected. And the main one that is affected is dopamine. And the substantia nigra actually produces dopamine. And as you lose neurons, or they're lost, or they're damaged, right, the amount of dopamine that is available actually reduces. And dopamine actually carries message on how to control body movements, first to the basal ganglia, and there to the primary motor cortex in the frontal lobe. So when you're answering this question, dopamine is pretty much the neurotransmitter associated with smooth and coordinated movements. And you need to make sure that the things that are highlighted there, you've actually got written down. So less dopamine means that the structures such as the primary motor cortex are involved in planning, coordinating, and initiating voluntary movements, receive fewer dopamine messages about motor activity. Therefore, the primary motor cortex, which executes voluntary movements, receives inadequate information due to insufficient and impaired activation by dopamine. So dopamine and its role in Parkinson's disease comes up quite a bit. So this section here, that last dot point, apart from what's also highlighted, should be something that you should be writing into your notes. So, Parkinson's disease, usually it tends to go into non-motor and motor symptoms. Some of the motor symptoms are tremors, muscle rigidity, slowness of voluntary movement, and then postural instability or balance issues and walking disturbances. So they're the motor ones, and they're the ones that you should remember. So make sure you remember the four main symptoms. Non-motor symptoms include a loss of sense of smell, sweating, fatigue, confusion, and panic attacks. There is now research evidence that midbrain dopamine neurons release not only dopamine but also GABA. So sometimes the question does ask about GABA, but more often than not, it's asking about dopamine in exams. It is believed that targeting only dopamine for treatment may explain why initial improvements with Parkinson's disease tend not to persist and eventually disappear. So, simple trick for remembering Parkinson's disease, shuffling gait, so they make small little steps, mask-like face, so it's very little movement in the face, akinesia, rigidity, and tremors. Tremors is the main one that you need to focus on, though. With the nervous system, understand the different divisions of the nervous system, particularly the sympathetic nervous system. Remember that it's part of the autonomic nervous system, not automatic, which is part of the peripheral nervous system, and you're forgetting the levels more often than not. Know how neurotransmitters work, be able to explain the lock and key process. Also be able to draw a diagram. This was a question a couple of years ago, and I haven't seen it since, but they might bring it back up. Understand some basic symptoms of Parkinson's disease and the believed causes, so dopamine and GABA.